And we are ready to go. Here we go, team. Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Trudy Murata, a volunteer community ambassador with AARP Virginia. And from our earliest beginnings, AARP has championed lifelong learning. That's why AARP Virginia is thrilled to bring you our third year of Tuesday Explorers, a lifelong learning program offered every Tuesday from January through the end of April at 3 o'clock East Coast time for all of our curious explorers. For more than 60 years, AARP has been a wise friend and a fierce defender, helping individuals to ensure that their money, health, and happiness live as long as they do. And AARP has earned a reputation as this wise friend and fierce defender through trusted information, tools, advocacy designed to protect the health and financial security of older Americans and empower them to choose how they live as they age. By promising to act as this wise friend and fierce defender, AARP is helping people who are 50 plus and their families feel confident, in control, and secure as they age. And as this wise friend in your corner, AARP helps you protect yourself and your loved ones from fraud and scams through our Fraud Watch network. Get healthy and stay healthy. Care for loved ones, make connections, plan a trip, learn new technologies, attend a class, and have fun while learning, while we are doing here today with our Tuesday Explorer program. So let me turn the program over to my AARP colleague, friend, and almost sister, sister friend, Lily Lou. I'll give the program to you.
Thank you, Trudy. Hello, everyone. Welcome. This has been such a fun journey with Trudy, and today we have another volunteer colleague, Mr. Don Harmon, joining us. We've been so delighted to bring to everyone the Northern Virginia idea of the Tuesday Explorers. I'd like to give a shout out to the AARP staff team led by Amber Sultani and also another fellow volunteer, Subasati. This is their brainchild, so that while we are stuck inside with the 6 inches of snow I saw someone put in the chat in New York, we have the ability to literally roam through geography and time. We are so fortunate during this Black History Month to have a very esteemed speaker. Let me first allow our guest speaker, invite her to say a few words of greeting. Dr. Masur, hello.
I'm excited to be here, and I'm welcoming everybody to hear what I have to say on the Underground Railroad. This is very exciting.
Well, you are truly one of the people that I had a vision for why we're doing this series. Number one, we had thought about the fact that AARP's founder, Dr. Ethel Percy-Andrus, had always encouraged folks to have purpose and meaning in retirement. She actually had the word refirement. And what you have done with your background and now what you're doing in refirement is really inspirational. So I wanted to give a thanks to the Arlington Public School in Virginia because they had this beautiful graphic as we commemorate during Black History Month, the unknown heroes of the Underground Railroad. I had seen Dr. Masur a flyer about her speaking in the community, and I said, I must invite her because her background and her own life story is so interesting. Dr. Masur, won't you tell us a little bit about yourself, please?
Well, I went to college in Western Massachusetts to Mount Holyoke. I got a PhD at the University of Chicago in cultural anthropology, and I spent 25 years working for the National Park Service. I've been retired about 8 years.
Well, I was so intrigued when I was trying to put together this with your kind help, this slideshow, which we will give to everybody, that you have really turned this academic discipline into something very meaningful. Can you tell us a little bit about your practice of anthropology. And then I have put in the slideshow the link of a very interesting article where you were interviewed about how you have used your academic training in the public sphere.
Well, there are anthropologists who do not work in academia, and I'm one. And I was lucky enough to get a job with a National Park Service as an anthropologist. And basically, anthropology is looking at the cultural aspects of life, cross-cultural between different countries, different groups, the point of view, the way of interacting, the basically the lifestyle.
I think we need to invite you back for Women's History Month next month. But tell us how just something in graduate school has turned into a lifelong passion. I myself am fascinated by oral histories. What is the genesis of this book, please?
Well, a friend and I both missed talking to our grandmothers. Mine died before I was born. And we called this project, Oral History Project, Jewish Grandmothers as a joke, but the publisher took the title, and we wanted to talk to women who had come from Europe and had been old enough to remember what Europe was like, Eastern Europe, and could tell us about the transition and living in the United States too. And I prefer, instead of saying acculturation, I'd say, or rather, instead of assimilation, I'd rather say acculturation, because they don't leave their old culture behind.
Excellent. I agree with that as an immigrant child, with my mother and my father being acculturated. That's beautiful. Thank you. Well, why we wanted to invite you is number one, what has been so fascinating about this series, and we're going to have Dr. Masur's video also available, but the past few videos we're going to put in the chat. So anybody who missed this is able to see it and see the recordings. If any of you have been with us throughout this whole series this winter or have caught one or two, please feel free to put in the chat how many you've seen, because the inspirational story of your own background is you have continued what you actually did for a career, for a salary, but now in refinement. So you had been working on something called the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom. That is fascinating. Could you tell us a bit about that, Dr. Masur?
Well, Congress passed an act creating the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom program to be run by the National Park Service. And the idea was to provide a network uniting people across the country who had been working on the history of the Underground Railroad in their locales, who didn't necessarily know anybody else was working on it. And when they found out, they wanted to be able to exchange information. And what we developed in the program was people submitted an application with the documented history that they had found of the Underground Railroad in their locale, so that that information would be saved. Because so often people who work on local history keep it all in their attic or their basement, and it's not, they don't have an opportunity to share it.
That's a wonderful idea. When you think about a network, AARP has a state office in every state, including District of Columbia, Puerto Rico. And so this idea of having the local community level history be preserved, that's fascinating. You sort of eased into this because your first ranger at the NPS National Park Service was nearby.
Yes, I worked in the Washington office, and then I switched to a historic site in Towson, Maryland, called Hampton National Historic Site. It's kind of underappreciated. It's a Georgian mansion. It's huge. It's bigger than Mount Vernon, and it still has a lot of the outbuildings from the 19th century. 18th and 19th century. And as a park site, You can see in this picture, there's a ranger who's basically explaining the background of the building, the family that lived there, and the people who were enslaved there. It was a plantation from the 1790s until the Civil War.
I had no idea that there's something like this close by to Northern Virginia. Thank you for bringing this to my attention. And then what I think most intrigued me about your own personal life story is you could reach retirement age and then just literally go to the beach, but you chose not to. What was that fork in the road decision for you, Dr. Masur?
Well, I didn't want to be bored when I retired, and I was trying to think of what I could do. And my first idea was to go back to my dissertation and look at the notes I had taken while I was living in Spain doing the research and finish taking advantage of the notes. I was able to get a 3-month fellowship from the college I went to, and I went back to Spain and I did some research there. And I told everybody I was going to write an article. But when I came back, I couldn't get away from the Underground Railroad. It kind of snagged me, and I remembered all the stories I had found out, and I remembered people's interest, and I didn't want it to disappear. The institutional memory that I had acquired, I did not want to disappear. So I switched, I kind of put my Spanish material away, and I remembered that a publisher, local press that does local history, had been interested in the Underground Railroad in the Washington area, and I contacted them again, and they were still interested. And so at that point, I decided to sign a contract with them, and that produced the first book, The Heroes of the Underground Railroad Around Washington, D.C.
Yes, I would love to invite folks in the audience to put in the chat if you too felt that when you walked out of your job, so much tacit knowledge was walking out with you, and whether any of you have followed Dr. Mazur's example and taken what you had done for a salary and now do it for a passion. So I'm so proud of you. You have gifted me, I'm going to lift up the 2 books. You had gifted me copies of these 2 books. Which one came first? And tell us a little bit about that first book, please.
Well, the first one is the one on the left, Heroes of the Underground Railroad Around Washington, D.C. And that one came out of what I actually did. I was the manager of the Network to Freedom program for the Washington area. And after I did that, I started thinking, well, maybe I can do a second one. The pandemic came, and I found something to keep me busy during the pandemic by working on Maryland freedom seekers. And that's what I call the people who escaped from slavery. So the first one included people who were helping people escape and people who escaped. And the second one is just people who escaped.
Wow. Trudy, by any chance, do we have members of the audience who have a similar trajectory in their life after hearing Dr. Mazur's life story?
Not that they have put in chat.
Any questions up or comments up until this point?
We do have one question, and that is, what year was the National Underground Railroad Network passed by Congress? And I think they're referring to the Network to Freedom Act. Are you familiar with that, Jenny?
Yes, unfortunately, you've caught me off guard. I did
That's
not.
okay. I got you covered. 1998.
It took a couple years for us to figure out how to translate the act into a real program. And then it was started after I joined. I joined before it had a website before we had started the applications for the information on the history. And over 17 years, when I was working with it, we dealt with people from all over the country, even in Hawaii, we didn't get as far as Alaska yet, but and we did go to the Virgin Islands to look at the history of slavery there and the history of resistance to slavery.
Thank you for that excellent question, because when I looked on C-SPAN, there you were already early on, trying. So if anybody would be interested in looking, just Google that, because you were out spreading the word about the network. And that is something that you're now treasuring for yourself, to be able to tell the stories. Let's delve a little deeper then into the why of taking all this on, when I keep thinking you could be at the beach.
Well, I wanted to dispel the misconceptions about the Underground Railroad. I wanted to publicize people, heroes and sheroes, that are less well known than Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, who usually you hear a lot about during Black History Month. There's now a park, 2 parks for Harriet Tubman. So I wanted an appreciation for the suffering and nature of enslavement. And I wanted to amplify the qualities of these heroes and sheroes as an example for people to realize what they had gone through. And of course, I wanted to create an appreciation for local history. People don't always realize that something happened right where they live if they delve into it. Something interesting, I guess I should say. I'm doing this as a public education, not to earn a living. And I'm doing it through community level outreach, through public libraries, book festivals, and talks like this one.
That's fabulous. That was how I first found you, Dr. Masur. I saw a flyer about a local talk that you were giving. May I ask just real quick, if they're little known, how did you unearth their stories? Is there one quick anecdote about something that we can learn as we're trying to document, preserve our own local history?
Well, some families have kept the traditions and actually have the documents, or have been able to document the history that their family went through. One of the stories I'm going to tell is documented by one of the descendants who did a very complex genealogy. The other thing is, you can go and look at what we call primary sources, which are sources from the period of the event or the person's life, and which are written by somebody who was present at whatever the event was or whose life it was. And so we have memoirs and so-called slave narratives, which were written by people who escaped slavery with the help of the abolitionists who wanted to promote anti-slavery feeling. There are trials and tax records and censuses. There are newspapers from the period. There are runaway ads, which are fascinating. And there then is the question of who should you focus on. One of it things is geography. So I picked the DC area and then Maryland because that's what I knew about from working. And I wanted men and women, and I wanted people who had helped and people who had escaped.
Wow, this is such a rich process and so important. I'm so glad we've invited you during Black History Month, because It's the local history. As a matter of fact, I invite the friends in the audience, if you know of anything or want more information about the network, let's help you get your local history documented and preserved. When you mentioned the runaway ads, that just touched my heart because I've been watching some of the PBS shows and the documentaries, and it's just heartrending. You must have at times really just sat there, Dr. Masur, and just had to sit for a moment because you were in the middle of people's life story.
Well, I really did, and I identified to some extent with them, and I realized what they had gone through, that it wasn't just something you read about, it was real.
Yes.
And I have some of my favorite heroes, but they went through all kinds of things, as you're going to hear from the examples, and they suffered all kinds of things. And it was something that was true of anybody who was enslaved, regardless of where it was.
Right. The extraordinary efforts and the determination and the resilience of quote unquote ordinary people. I wanted to let the audience be able to delve in a little deeper. I specifically took a photo of your dedication. The first book, as you had said, is the one that came out in 2019. And I just love the way that you highlighted to independent and local historians who researched the resistance to slavery through flight. And I'm showing the front and back of the actual two books. Would you like to comment on any of the actual process to put together the cover or the back?
Well, what's interesting is finding the illustrations. If you look at books on the Underground Railroad, they usually have the same images on the cover and inside. And so I made an effort to look at local historical societies and places besides the Library of Congress, which is free and easy to get to. And so I have on the left, I have on the cover, I have Leonard Grimes. That picture came from the Library of Congress. And on the right, I have Anne Maria Weems, and that picture came from William Still's book. And so I got it from the New York Public Library.
Wonderful.
The right, there's something from the Library of Congress. And then the other one was a symbol that was used by the anti-slavery groups.
Thank you so much for this important research because because everyone's going to get this PowerPoint, I took a scan of the table of contents. So you will see how wide and interesting. And thank you for having her story, a woman's story, women's story in this. Why don't we first go into the second book and then we'll go deeper into the actual individual stories. This book, as you said, was the benefit, quote unquote, of the pandemic. And once again, I want to read the dedication page to those who work to uncover and share the history of Maryland's freedom seekers. A little bit about the background of the cover and the back of this book, please.
Well, I chose to concentrate on people who escaped because I think Underground Railroad is a metaphor for something that was new at the time that it was occurring, and people thought people were escaping miraculously, as though on an railroad that ran under the ground so you couldn't see it. And I think in a way that takes away from the fact that it couldn't have happened without the people who were escaping from slavery. They are really the reason for the Underground Railroad.
Yes, the persistence, the resilience. And once again, the table of contents to see the great variety of stories that you have highlighted. This might be a good time because I'm a family caregiver. I always say we have to hydrate and self-care. Dr. Masur can take a drink of water while I ask Trudy, are there any comments or feedback or any questions at this point?
Yes, there was one question. And I think Ms. Masur answered it a little bit, but maybe I could ask her to elaborate on it. And that question was, did you start your research in localities by visiting the public libraries, or where did you begin? Can you just tell us once again how that happened?
Well, part of my job was to set up meetings of people, local people, librarians, archivists, local historians, anybody who might have an interest, people from museums, to talk about the Underground Railroad. And it turned out some people thought about slavery, but they didn't think about escape from slavery as being linked. And that's where the stories started appearing. People would say they had something from where they were working, and sometimes there was an academic source that had footnotes that took you to somebody who was not the subject of the book. So really and then I met people who were doing the research, and they were kind enough to let me use their research.
It really is a network of researchers and historians. That's a wonderful metaphor, too. We're now going to be so lucky to have you give us some of the stories. And this one, I just love the title that you use for the chapter. He never forsook the Underground Railroad. What is the story of Mr. Grimes, please?
Well, Leonard Grimes is one of my favorites, and I guess I should say Reverend Leonard Grimes, because by the time he died, he had been ordained. He was born a freeman in Leesburg, Virginia, and he moved to DC to work as a teenager. He eventually established a taxi business using a horse and carriage. And that was a great cover for Underground Railroad activities. He got involved. We don't know if he was working on his own or with other people. And we don't know how many times he helped people, but we do know that he helped a woman named Patty and her children. Now, under law, when a woman is enslaved, her children are automatically enslaved as they're born. And so he had somebody who was married to a free man who wanted freedom for his family, but the only way that they could get it was to escape and go to Canada.
Wow.
So he wasn't Reverend Grimes yet, was taking them in his carriage from Leesburg to Washington, D.C., which is where he was living. And then they would have gone on to the next stage from there. And he was successful in getting them there. But then about a year or two later, the rumor got to the owner that he might have helped in the escape. And since it was a woman and 6 children, that's quite an investment for a slave owner. So he got a warrant for arrest, and Leonard Grimes was arrested and tried and convicted, despite the best efforts of his lawyers, who got people who had been his customers and other people to give recommendations or testimony to the good character of Leonard Grimes. And he was convicted in 1840 on very flimsy evidence. The evidence was supposed to be that the carriage did not stop where it usually stopped en route between Leesburg and Washington, and that the curtains were closed in the carriage, so you couldn't see who was inside of it. And the person who provided that testimony was not a reliable witness. Nonetheless, Grimes was sentenced to 2 years in the Virginia penitentiary, which was considered a light sentence. He had to leave obviously his family and his business behind, and his friends. And he spent the 2 years in prison doing hard labor and wearing chains. And he must have grieved the whole time. However, something happened that changed his life. He had a spiritual awakening, and he began to preach to the fellow prisoners and the jailers, so that when he got out of prison, he got a license to preach. He was a Baptist. And he then had two vocations in life: the Underground Railroad and the church.
Wow. I can
So,
see adjectives, you know, persistent and resilient and, you know, innovation, ingenuity. I think I can see why you highlighted his story.
well,
Ooh,
he escaped to New England after he was released from prison with his family. And in Boston, he was offered to be pastor at the 12th Baptist Church. He made the church into quite it prospered. It became very important church for African Americans, and he became ordained. And at that point, he was able to be involved in the Underground Railroad openly. And he
wow.
involved in two cases. One was the first under the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act in Boston, and the second was the last one in Boston under the Fugitive Slave Act, Anthony Burns.
In researching each of these stories, did you ever overlap with descendants by any chance?
Well, the third story, I overlapped with descendants, the story of Anne Maria Gant.
Mhm.
And actually, the story came by way of the descendant who had done the genealogy work to see what she could find to support what she had heard from her family. And she was very surprised to find that it was almost all documentable.
Right. Oh, that's another important thing that we as, you know, local residents can help by reaching out to scholars. And I'm so glad that the network at the National Park Service exists. That is such an important tool for intra communication, I guess is the word. May we move on to the second story because this photo, this picture, this image really intrigues me. I think somebody disguised as a man to escape.
It's a teenage girl who was born in Rockville, Maryland. Her father was free, her mother was not, so that this girl and her siblings were all enslaved. The father had an arrangement for a while with the owner he would pay something every month and the family could live with him. However, a disaster happened, which often happened in the lives of enslaved people. The owner died and everything was up for grabs. And this man knew that the family could be sold and scattered. He did two things. He went to somebody who was an operative in the Underground Railroad in Washington, Jacob Bigelow, and he himself went to New York City, which would have been quite a trip because this is somebody who had probably always stayed in the Washington area and who, as a freeman, was at risk traveling even if he had his papers. So he went twice to New York. He was able to raise money for the family. He came back and it was decided to buy his wife, his oldest daughter, and two of his sons. But the girl who's dressed as a boy up there, carriage driver, was not able to be have her freedom purchased because she was owned by a slave dealer and he was hoping for a high price. And so he refused to sell her, which was a quandary then, because the Underground Railroad operative preferred to act legally and purchase people or get their freedom through trials. So the only recourse they saw was for her to escape. And they managed to smuggle her out of where she was in Maryland into DC, but they had to figure out a way to get her to Canada. And they came up with, I say they because it was Jacob Bigelow, the local operative, who was in contact with people in Philadelphia and New York, and with a philanthropist in New York who provided money for the escape. And she managed to get smuggled out of Maryland to Washington. And in order for people not to catch her, the pursuers usually assume the person ran north immediately. So they started looking for her. She stayed hidden for 8 weeks. And during those 8 weeks, Jacob Bigelow trained her to act like a boy and to wear boys' clothing, because you have to remember at that time of history, girls did not wear pants. They did not act like boys. And they didn't carry themselves like boys. They would have been much more ladylike. And that was what was expected. So once that had passed, they came up with the scheme of finding a doctor who was an abolitionist who was willing to drive her in his carriage, his rented carriage, from Washington to Philadelphia. Now, where did she meet him? She met him right outside the White House gate. So that's a different association with the White House. She got to Philadelphia. It was a big to-do because the disguise was very clever and everybody was taken with it who found out about it. However, the person who had funded it said, don't talk about it too much because we want to use this again. And if the word gets out, then it'll be impossible to use this strategy. And once she was in Philadelphia, she had her picture taken, which would have been a daguerreotype. And there was one taken for her mother and one taken for the man who, William Still, who had greeted her and taken down her history. Then she was sent on to New York, and there she stayed with the philanthropist, and she celebrated Thanksgiving with him. She was upstairs in a locked room wearing her disguise, and he and his friends were downstairs celebrating Thanksgiving. She ate her plum pudding and her turkey by herself because they were worried that at any time somebody could come to the house and she would have to flee.
Yes.
After that, it was arranged for her to go from one place to another where there was somebody from the Underground Railroad. And she ended up at the bridge in Niagara Falls, crossed the bridge with the person who was with her, her chaperone guide, so to speak. And she found her aunt and uncle who had escaped previously. And she went to live with them. When they were arriving, they ran into the uncle and he looked at her. She was dressed as a girl by then. And he said, "That's my niece." And he was so excited and overjoyed. And he couldn't wait to get her home to his wife, who was also overjoyed. So that was a happy ending.
Yes. Well, the erasure of identity is one of the the key things in stories like this. So did you mention that her narrative was documented? Someone did take down her story.
Yes, there was somebody who worked for the what was called the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee. It was a committee that helped people escaping. And he would greet the people and take notes. He'd ask them why they escaped, who they escaped from, what they had suffered. And so he was very taken with her story. And in fact, there are letters that he includes. He published a book after the Civil War. He did not destroy his records. He saved them, and then in order to make money after the Civil War, in order to survive, he published a book. And the book has turned out to be extremely documentable. And it has the illustration that you see there. It has all kinds of stories. And one strategy for researching the Underground Railroad is to take the stories, go to the places the people were from, and see if you can find any history about them or the people who owned them.
Oh my goodness. I can see many books coming further in your future, Dr. Masur, because each of these just expands into further narrative. Just real quick then, about what age was she during this period that we're talking about roughly?
Well, it starts out when she's 12. I think that's when her owner died, and several years passed, but she was not an adult when she escaped. She was probably a middle-aged teenager.
Oh, my goodness.
So they didn't want her to escape by herself. The Underground Railroad people who were helping her wanted her to have a companion till she got to her aunt and uncle.
Ooh, let's just let that sit for a minute about the reunion before we move on to story number 3. That was such a powerful one. Thank you for including that in the book.
You want me to go ahead?
Yes, please. Story 3 actually intrigued me because it's specific to Northern Virginia.
Yes, it is, and to Ohio. I think we may have had somebody from Ohio in the audience. I did this chapter from the point of view of Anna Maria Gant, because everybody looks at Nelson Gant. And she died in 1877 at only 50 years of age, but she had had quite a life. She had 12 pregnancies, of which she only raised 4 of the children to adulthood. She was born enslaved. She worked all her life. She was able to see freedom for herself, and she was able to see emancipation for all enslaved people under the 13th Amendment. She was able to live to a very prosperous life. Her husband had a large farm in Zanesville, Ohio. It was one of the largest in the county, and so their lifestyle was equivalent to a well-to-do white farmer. She had a piano in the house. Her three of her 4 children went to Oberlin College in Ohio, and she had rosewood furniture. She lived a good life by the end of her life, and her husband erected a memorial to her when she died as a testimony to their love. But we don't have any of her words directly. We have interviews that were done with Nelson Gant after her death. She was born in Loudoun County, Virginia, enslaved. She worked as a house servant, and she met Nelson, who was called Talbot as an enslaved person. He then became Nelson Talbot Gant when he was free. They fell in love. They married, even though they were owned by different people, and they had the permission of her owner. So they were married by a Methodist minister in her parlor. And that was extremely unusual. That was 1843. They were able to choose each other. They were able to stay together with each other until the end of her life, 30 years. And they were united by love the whole time. They were married 2 years when, again, the owner of Nelson died, but instead of being sold, he had a different quandary. He was freed, but he was to go with the other people that were freed by this, under the will of the same man, to Ohio, to Zanesville. And by Virginia law, he had 1 year to stay after being freed before he had to leave. Well, you can imagine he did not want to leave Anna Maria. He tried to raise the money, but he didn't raise it in time, so he had to leave. But he promised her he would return in 6 weeks. Now you can imagine during those 6 weeks how she would have felt. Would he come back? Would he find somebody else? Was freedom better than risking the return, etc.? So he did return, and he had made contacts. He had met people in the Underground Railroad. He had gotten some false papers for her so that she could pass as free. And he had gotten some money pulled together to try and buy her freedom. He goes back. The owner refuses the money. And so he goes to plan number 2. He gets the false papers. She disappears. He disappears. And they're together, but they're together in jail in Washington, D.C. in 1846. They were betrayed during the escape. So the owner in Virginia of Anna Maria petitioned that he would be taken back and she would be taken back to Leesburg, he for trial and she back to slavery. And they were lucky. The executor of the will of his former owner was able to help them get a lawyer. She remember, he's in prison, she's enslaved, there's pressure put on them to tell the quote unquote truth about what happened and to give in. They both stand firm, they won't do that. And then the trial occurred, and it was an extraordinary trial. The lawyers began by speaking of Talbot's feelings being equivalent to the feelings of a white person. That was very unusual. That was not what was recognized. As you know, enslaved people were property and they were considered inferior. And so this was a very unusual defense. The charge was defrauding the owner of her $300 value for Anna Maria and for carrying her out of state. Now, the next step was going to be for her to testify against him, but they were able to argue that the two of them had been united in holy wedlock and were strongly attached, so that when they argued that they had been married by a minister with the permission of Anna Maria's owner, the judges recognized the marriage and said it was a marriage that was registered in heaven. And so that Talbot got off, was freed, but that still left Anna Maria enslaved. So he stayed around for another year, and she was still working for her former owner, and he was able to raise some money, and finally the owner gave in and sold her. And the two of them worked to pay off the expenses of the trial. Remember, he only had a year to be back in Virginia. And he was risking being enslaved again if they caught him staying longer than that. But they were able to get the money, repay the debts, and go to Zanesville, Ohio in 1850. And
I'm so grateful that you started with the end of her life so that we knew the narrative arc of her life. She had some wonderful, I don't even know how to say this, not wonderful days, but she had the seeking of freedom. She got something for herself and her family. I think this has been such a rich storytelling session, because we could go for each of these stories, we could go days with just number one, how you found the information and everything. I just wanted to show everyone that, Dr. Masur has been such an advocate for making sure that things are preserved. She's gone literally all over to book festivals and local libraries. And during the pandemic, she very fortunately could be a guest on many virtual shows and events. Because I think for me, I did want to put this in the slide to share with everyone, is that what you have shown me as an example of refirement is that you took something that you were paid to do, but found meaning and purpose in doing it after leaving the workforce. And if you just want to touch on a few of the things that what you've been doing, because it's really, for me, has been a wonderful example about how to take something you were doing as a profession into refirement.
well, I continued to learn. I was intellectually stimulated. I love doing research, so I was able to continue doing that. I got a sense of accomplishment. You can imagine publishing a book twice. I got to meet new people, and to my surprise, I went back to some of the people that I had known when I was working, and I've renewed the relationship with them, and I've done a little research with them or traveled with them to a Underground Railroad site, and I was able to share the information, and I was able to devote my time to something that was meaningful to me, that left a legacy, so to speak.
Yes, definitely. I did want to have folks know that you've had a lot of lessons learned, and if you won't mind just speaking briefly about that, because it's a great role model for all of us who might have a passion that we want to take into refirement.
Well, I was lucky to have made contact with a publisher dedicated to publishing illustrated local histories. It's called History Press. And they publish things all over the country that are about the locales. And I was able to work with this publisher who was dedicated to the same goals I was. They were willing to publish something that would only have a couple thousand copies printed, because they print many books instead of just a few books with many copies. And I basically had to create my own book tours. So I got in touch with public libraries, house museums that I had known when I was working, and book festivals. And I spoke on some panels.
Well, we've been so lucky, so fortunate to have you as our guest. I wanted to at least show the folks the publishing house that has worked with Dr. Masur, because it's important as we learn about local history to identify those who are working with us. Once again, these are the covers of her two books, Dr. Masur's book in 2019, and then the product of the pandemic 2023. Let me stop sharing the screen so that we take a few questions. And I just wanted to say, Dr. Masur, it's so easy during Black History Month to just blithely say Happy Black History Month or something. What you have done is truly a legacy that you should be proud of. Thank you for being our guest today.
Well, thank you.
did have a couple of questions. The first one is, of those individuals that you did the research on or looked into, what was the longest journey, and how long did journeys like this, is, I want to say maybe usually or typically take? How long did it take them to get from one place to a safe place?
Well, most of the people I was looking at were from Virginia and Maryland, but there is a recent book that's come out about a couple who fled from Georgia to Boston and then to England. And one of the people in the book, the second book, got from Maryland to Connecticut, settled down in Hartford. And then in 1850, when there was a new law passed that encouraged people to pursue people who'd escaped, he went to England. And he stayed in England for quite a while, and then we don't know what happened to him. So that's pretty far.
Yeah,
Yeah.
interesting.
Wow.
And how were they able to communicate or interconnect? Do we have any insight into how they shared the information of the paths to take?
Well, for one thing, in the Washington area at least, there were a lot of interconnections. The owners intermarried, and they would take their enslaved people with them when they married. They would have a dowry. One of the relatives would give enslaved people, if you can imagine that, as a gift to a member of the family, and that family member might be living somewhere else, or there was somebody who was free or who had escaped. And the people who were enslaved were able to go to market. They're able to serve at the table of the owner, and they were not invisible. They were not deaf. They heard what was going on, and then the word would get spread when they interacted with people from another plantation.
Wonderful. We've had such wonderful feedback in the chat, Dr. Masur. Thank you to everyone for joining us. There was not a way that we couldn't have you on as we commemorate Black History Month. Thank you for what you're doing for our nation's history and for the local area that we're in, the local Virginia area. Thank you to everyone. And our dear colleague, volunteer colleague, Don Harmon, has put in the chat the upcoming sessions. Please, please, please join us, because as you know now, after seeing this series, these 2 months, it's basically about what are ordinary people doing in refinement that is extraordinary. So Dr. Masur, before I hand it back to Trudy, let me first thank you. And if you'd like to say a few words of farewell to our audience who've stayed on with us and have learned so much.
Well, I'm hoping they'll be inspired, since I'm a local historian. I'm hoping that they will look into the local history around them and maybe look into their family history. Look in what's in the attic and the basement and what their relatives told them as they got older.
Yes. And you all heard the alarm. I'm a family caregiver, so my alarm just went off. But basically, we all now have a smartphone. Just hit record and get those stories, document, right? So
Exactly. Very good. Lily, thank you for finding Ms. Masur for us. Thank you, Ms. Masur, for sharing your valuable time and expertise with us today. The audience has truly enjoyed every minute of it. So our Tuesday Explore program will continue next week, same day, same time, 3 p.m. East Coast time. You can find out what we've got coming up next by going to aarp.org/Virginia events. And for those of you that are across the country, if you want to find out what's happening in your area locally, you can go to aarp.org/community events. But the Tuesday Explore program may only show up on the Virginia events page. So thank you all for joining us today. Thank you for sharing your afternoon with us. Until next time, Stay curious and keep exploring. We'll see you next week. Thanks.